Kevin Deal here, and on today's episode, we're going to be doing part 2 of our test of the Canon R7. Shit, I gotta delete all those. So welcome to today's episode. My name is Kevin Deal. If you're not familiar with this channel, I do gear reviews, I talk technique, and then I dive a little bit into film. If any of that sounds awesome to you, click the subscribe button below. I'd appreciate it. I want to thank all of you who watched part 1 of my review of the Canon R7, and if you haven't watched part 1, I'll put a link in the description below. So in part 1, I tackled a portrait shoot in the studio and on location. I also did some initial impressions and an unboxing. On today's episode, we're gonna get a little bit more technical. I'm also debating on making this a 3-part review because I am gonna be spending the next 3 weeks with it. I think I might dive more into the technical stuff. Obviously, I'm gonna be doing some bird shooting today. I've got this awesome 120-300 2.8 from Sigma, and I want to thank the Camera Exchange for sponsoring this episode and allowing me to borrow this lens. As you all know, I'm mainly a portrait photographer. I definitely don't own this lens. The secondary thing I wanted to test by getting this lens is some of you are asking, hey, how does the R7 perform with third-party lenses? And so I decided to get a third-party lens, telephoto, adapted, test it out, see how the autofocus works. I also got the Sigma 18-35 1.8, which is a very popular third-party lens in the Canon EF mount. Just like in part 1, if you're watching this and you're hoping that I'm going to be doing reviews of the new RFS lenses, I'm not. I am a primary R5 shooter. I am purchasing the R7 as my primary video body, and then I'm also using it as a backup in case I have any issues with my R5, heaven forbid. I'm also going to be testing out 2 different SD cards. I've got 2 Lexar cards. One is like a 250 megabyte per second, and I think it's a V60. And then the second one is a V90, 2000 times 300 megabit per second, just because I want to show you guys how different cards perform in this camera body. Now, I will tell you that I did a test yesterday and I was able to get about 62 uncompressed raw shots in burst mode, in the high performance burst mode with the R7. So we'll see how that translates today with this big lens attached to it. Anyway, without further ado, let's go shoot some birds.
So this is probably a good time to point out that the R7 is weather sealed. I forgot to cover that in part 1. I started off light. I wanted to just test out the autofocusing. I took a picture of the sun because it was just a really beautiful sunrise. And then I turned on the animal tracking and started taking pictures of some ducks that were nearby. And then I tested it while they were swimming around in the water because it was a little bit faster, just kind of working my way up to the faster action. A lesson I learned is to check your monopod thread size, which mine wasn't compatible with this lens. I had an Atomos Ninja on it. It was about 12 pounds, and now my arms are ripped. So the birds were just as cranky as I was about the heat. They weren't really feeling like flying. The only bird I found was this 737 from Southwest Airlines, which just wasn't what I set out to do. I found this cool spot, and I see this guy just sitting on a branch. What, you don't see him? Hold on, let me pull out the 300mm. There we go. So this heron, which I will incorrectly refer to as a pelican throughout this video, making my bird study merit badge counselor and Boy Scouts very upset, was just chilling over here. I wanted to preserve battery life, so I turned off my camera, and of course that's right when I saw something coming down from the trees to my right.
I had this really great shot that happened where I was just kind of sitting there. I actually had the camera off, and I saw a pelican like flying out of the trees right over there. I was actually sitting like over there a couple hundred yards, and I saw him fly out of the trees. If you want a testament to how fast this camera turns on and how quickly I can react, I actually had the camera turned off because I was doing something else. And I saw him flying out of the trees there, and I was like, oh crap, I turned the camera on, I locked onto him, and just held down the shutter release, kind of a spray and pray situation. And you can look at the examples that I'm showing you right now, and you can tell me if you're a professional bird photographer, a wildlife photographer, if that is good enough.
So what you're seeing here is a sequence of 50 shots I shot in uncompressed RAW. I missed the first few because I was picking up my camera, trying to acquire focus. When you look at this, we got focus. That's at 100% right there. And just good sequence. You tell me, is that fast enough? Is that burst mode fast enough? And this is mechanical, of course. I am using the Lexar 250 megabit per second, 1667 times SD card, so that way you know what is going on in the background with the processing on the camera. That's when the buffer started to run out. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 4 shots. So I would say I got about 46 shots before the buffer ran out. You know, that looks pretty good. Now this is at 2.8. I haven't done any processing to it. That's just straight out of the camera. You be the judge, and you can determine as to whether or not this works for you.
See, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not that patient. Probably why I don't shoot birds very often. This lens, it hasn't, I feel like it hasn't missed a ton. So far, if everything that I see in the camera translates to the screen, I'm gonna be happy with my wildlife photography today. But maybe this isn't good enough for you, or maybe this is exactly what you're looking for. Only you can tell yourself that. I can't tell you that. I can just show you what I can do with it, and then, whoa, hold on. All right, and this is why we record. So I just had a low-flying aircraft go by. I had the electronic shutter on, and I have the Lexar 300 megabit per second, 2000 times card in here. So we'll see what our keeper rate was on that airplane that just flew by. I always love those surprises when we do these episodes.
I spent another 10 minutes or so just shooting bikers as they went by in the electronic shutter mode. I got anywhere between 50 to 70 or so in a burst, an electronic shutter through these sequences. I didn't do anything super scientific. I'm just letting you know that with my 300 megabyte per second card, it seemed to keep up just fine in the electronic shutter mode. And of course, I was getting ready to pack up, and that heron that I saw earlier that I was impatient about finally flew away right as I was walking to my car. I'm also happy to report that the airplane tracked perfectly. I got a 100% success rate in the electronic shutter. Everything looked tack sharp. So I did go out and do my test with the Sigma 120-300. My initial impressions are, with the third-party lenses, is that ignorance is bliss. If you have never used an RF lens in your life and you put these on your R7, you put these on one of the other R bodies, you're not really going to think that the autofocus is sluggish or bad in any way, shape, or form. There were a couple times where I was like, oh, maybe there's some issues, and then I realized that it was my fault. Like I didn't have my switch set right on the telephoto lens where something was too close. Another thing I noticed is when I shot the cyclists, I didn't actually put the camera into people AF. I had it still in animal AF, but these shots will show you that if you forget to switch it, it still did a pretty good job. I really do think that these are acceptable images, but I don't think that makes it a true test. So I went ahead and went to a park that was close by that had a skate park there, and I shot some skateboarders. Now, I did put in a treat for some of you who can't afford lenses that are 3 times more than your body, which this Sigma is 3 times more expensive than an R7. And I know that a lot of you don't have telephoto lenses that go to 2.8. So I thought that if I just shot this lens at 2.8, it would be completely unfair to all of you. And it also wouldn't let you guys know how the high ISO performance was doing wildlife and sports. So I went ahead and stopped down to like F8, F11. I put it in auto ISO and just let the camera do its thing. And we will take a look at the files and see what we think. I didn't really notice a lot of issues with it. One thing that I did notice is when I put it in AF mode number 2, where it's supposed to ignore obstacles, I saw that sometimes it would still, like, I'd be following a skateboarder and then they would pass behind another skateboarder, and then the AF would like latch on to the skateboarder in the foreground. I don't think I did anything wrong with the AF. Call me out in the comments below if I did, but I don't think I did. And it may just be something that they're gonna have to fix with firmware updates. In general, it did a good job. I could reacquire focus fairly quickly. And man, look at how the continuous autofocus just sticks to the subject. This is of course with a third-party lens. So here's some shots I took stop down, where my ISO ranged anywhere from 800 to 3200. I think everything looks acceptably sharp. I don't really think the noise is that bad. I think that you're gonna really like the results with this new R7. Now, obviously, when you open it up more, the bokeh looks better. You take it down to 100 ISO, it's gonna look more crisp, but the high ISO still performed really well. I took my R7 to the Trinity Groves area in downtown Dallas, which is really good for taking pictures of the skyline with telephoto lenses, as well as more bird photography. One thing I decided to do, I mentioned earlier, I accidentally had it in animal mode and track people. This time I intentionally put it in people mode. I'm happy to report that if you're in people AF and all of a sudden you see an animal come out of nowhere and you just pick up your camera and start shooting, it'll still track fairly well. I'm sure it does a little better if you're in the correct mode, but rest assured, you're still gonna get pretty good results. I also found that if you're trying to track a bird from the ground as it starts to fly, it tracks a lot better than if you just all of a sudden have to take your camera, find the bird, start tracking it, and then it passes in front of things that are similar in contrast, color, etc. And that's pretty much expected for most autofocus systems. So I wanted to also test out how tracking worked on vehicles. I also wanted to test out a new feature called raw burst mode and pre-shooting. This is a really cool new feature that not even my almost 3 times more expensive R5 and then the $1,000 more expensive R6 have. And that is the ability to hold down the shutter release right before you hit it, and it'll record a half a second before. This is great because you won't miss a big moment if you're just slightly late to the punch. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this only works in electronic shutter mode, and you cannot use it with back button focus. You have to use the shutter release. So the way it works is that you half press the shutter release down. The meter on the left you'll see will rise white. That means it's constantly monitoring. When you hit the shutter, it'll turn green, then red, then it'll peak at red, and then it'll gently drop down from red to black, and then you can reset. One thing to keep in mind is that when you turn your camera off, you have to go back to the menu and reset raw burst mode and set it up. So if you're gonna be taking breaks of long periods of time, just keep that in mind that you will have to manually set this up. So keep in mind that in raw burst mode, if you wanna see raw JPEG files individually, they have to be extracted at the camera. I found the feature to work really well. I think it's gonna be awesome for bird photography, quiet places like weddings so you don't miss that first kiss, and other situations where you just need to be really fast to the punch. Just like I noticed at the skateboard park, when I tried to put the autofocusing mode to where it would still go behind obstructions, it still didn't work very well. I'm hoping this is something that they update in firmware, or if I'm doing it wrong, tell me in the comments below. Like I said, raw burst mode cannot be found on either the R5 or the R6, which is pretty cool considering crop sensor cameras tend to be cheaper. Speaking of crop sensor versus full frame, let's do a noise test. Okay, so I did a noise test, nothing crazy or scientific here. Just wanted to see how my R5, which is the file on the left, compared to the R7, which is the file on the right. Now, I'm sure it's pretty obvious that there's a weird color cast on the file on the right, but at the time of this recording, there were no camera profiles available for Capture One, and a lot of other RAW editors don't have that support at this time. That's okay, we're doing a noise test, not a color test. I'm sure once the profiles are out, things are gonna look a lot better. From what I see here, the noise is fine. It doesn't seem to bother me. So 1600, both of these are very passable as files. You also have to make sure that you're looking at things the way it's actually going to be viewed and not get too caught into pixel peeping. Now let's move on to 3200 ISO. When we zoom in, we've got, well, it looks pretty good actually. Looking really good actually. It's a very acceptable amount of noise in my opinion. So nothing really crazy there at 3200 ISO, which is pretty much the highest I usually go anyway, but sometimes I go to 6400. So let's check out 6400 ISO. So 6400 ISO, there we go. At 6400 ISO, okay, so this is where you start seeing the R7, the APS-C file, start to fall apart in the shadow detail. This may be your threshold cutoff. The full frame R5 file on the left definitely looks better in the shadow detail. When you have low light, high ISO, you definitely get more noise on the APS-C sensor. Personally, this doesn't bother me. I came up on film. If you're looking at this stuff from a distance, you're looking at it digitally, you're not making prints and looking at it up close, it's most definitely still recoverable. You just need to pull up that denoise plugin. Okay, so let's move on to 12,800. The R5 on the left, yes, is going to resolve better than the R7 on the right still, but you can still see detail, like tear ducts under the eyes. You can see texture on the skin. So that's really not bad detail at all, considering that you're freaking doing 12,000. And also keep in mind, the R5 is almost $4,000 versus $1,500 on the R7. All right, so let's move on to 25,000 ISO. They both don't look that great. Honestly, how many of you shoot at 25,000 ISO on a regular basis? If you do, you're probably looking at neither of these cameras. So you're just gonna have to make your own judgment call. Is this good enough for you? It's good enough for me. I also want to point out I used the same exact lens on both shots, the RF28-70 f2. I also want to thank Eli for his help and point out to the world that he has a spot on his shirt. So I did mention at the beginning of the episode that I was going to test out the Sigma 18-35 1.8. I worked with Tatum and Valeria both in the studio and outdoors. I'm happy to report that it performed admirably adapted to the RF adapter that I used from Canon. The autofocus on it was snappy, it tracked well, the images resolved well, it gave me some really excellent quality. So if you're a third-party user, you're maybe looking into Tamron or Sigma adapted. When I tried touch and drag, when I used IAF, I'm happy to report there were no issues. I also tested out an Ef-135f2 Adapted. It's one of my favorite all-time portrait lenses. I just wanted to make sure that the R7 worked well with third-party lenses adapted, EF lenses adapted, and it's obviously going to work well with the native RF mount. I had fun with the Sigma 18-35 1.8, but I had to pull out Bazooka Joe one last time to shoot both Tatum and Valeria at 300mm f2.8 just to see how crazy the bokeh is on portraits. Anyway, I am going to have to do a part 3 of this review. Thanks for watching today. There's just so much to get around to on a brand new camera body, and I want to make sure that I help all of you out. The wildlife and sports was a lot more in depth than I thought it was going to be, and so I think that my trip out to the American Southwest would be better served as a third video on the R7 that I can do over the course of the next 3 weeks. And yeah, I hope that you found this video helpful. I hope that you found it useful, educational. If you like what you saw, please tell me in the comments below. I really do appreciate your support. And if you found this information helpful, I humbly ask you, click the subscribe button below. I'm going to keep putting out more videos like this. I love doing gear reviews. Gear reviews seem to be what you all are responding to the most on my channel. So that's a marriage that hopefully will be a good one. Anyway, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.